First of all, can I welcome everybody to this Zoom meeting of the PGES APPG. Our speakers today will be from the Energy Institute, and they'll be talking about the Energy Barometer and their findings. And I hope this will be a very constructive and informative meeting. Just before the recess, that's the parliamentary recess, we launched our energy priorities, policy priorities, in the light of the recovery from the coronavirus, which at the moment is still ongoing. And the 5 priorities were reduced waste energy, both in supply and demand, heat, and this is a very large energy consumption, retrospective and prospective building regulations that need to improve building and stock in both owned and rented sectors, new build and existing. Number 3, the future of gas decarbonisation must begin immediately so we can use existing infrastructure. Number 4, market design, whole system and operation. Our tax system undermines the low carbon future. VAT on energy savings measures 20%, VAT on energy we waste 8%. And then 5, flexibility to ensure greatest adoption and the least cost of weather-based energy. We made some suggestions to both the Prime Minister and the Chancellor Exchequer, and it'll be interesting to see how much they pick up on these as a result of the Energy Barometer. Just may I say just a few quick points on Zoom. Could you stay on mute unless you're going to speak? We have rather a lot of people registered on this call. I will chair the meeting and Matthew will take care of the technology and Megan the questions after the speakers. If you do want to actually take part, could you please use the chat function, which is obviously at the bottom of the screen for most of us. And if you're an iPad or others, you'll need to tap the screen to be able to do that. If you do want to ask an emergency question, could you wave like mad and either Megan or hopefully Matthew will pick it up. I would like to just say a special welcome to those who are new attendees or guests from member companies. There are a few new faces here, new MPs and new members. Very delighted to see you and thank you for taking part. We're always looking for new members, so if you wish to join or you know somebody who would, could you just get hold of Matthew. Our meeting is being recorded, so please feel free to Twitter it, including the hashtag @appgENERGY. We will put as much information on the website and in our journal, Energy Focus, and we will also carry a record of the meeting. So to the meeting, can I introduce, we have 3 speakers. The first one is Louise Kingham, who is the Chief Executive of the Energy Institute, and until recently was a member of our Executive Council. Louise will hand on to Steve Holliday, President of the Energy Institute and a former CEO of the National Grid. We'll hand on to Dr. Rob Gross, who's the Energy Institute Trustee and Director for UK Energy Research. All our reports will be published before recess is starting to produce. We approach the final of CoP26 and we'll make those available as we can. So Louise Kingham, can I hand over to you, please? And lovely to see you.
Thanks very much indeed, Ian, and I'll echo his warm welcome. It's nice to see some very familiar faces and also quite a few new ones too. And as Ian said, I'm Louise Kingham from the Energy Institute and one of 3 people that's going to introduce this report to you and its contents today. So I hope you're all well and safe. It's good to see you. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to be able to do this morning. As you'll hear, we feel that the views of energy professionals and indeed professional members within the Energy Institute here in the UK are really important. And now more than ever, they've been clearer about urgent action which is required for net zero. What they have to say amplifies similar points that are being made by a range actually of environmental groups, NGOs, business groups, industry leaders, and as you heard Ian summarise, the Parliamentary Group for Energy Studies' own work on policy priorities has some synergies and similarities too in terms of those we've identified as the issues that are most important. So I know that a number of you are fellows of the Energy Institute, but for those who are unaware, just very quickly, the Energy Institute is of and for those people who will need to deliver net zero, whilst continuing obviously to meet the needs of the world's populations in terms of access to energy right across the energy system. Now, in my humble experience over quite a few years now, energy professionals are pretty hard-headed, no-nonsense bunches. They're engineers, technicians, scientists, economists, driven by the evidence and the facts and of understanding the practicalities of all that is possible and what it takes indeed, to keep the electrons and the molecules flowing to our homes, our businesses, and of course our vehicles. So it means, I think, that we're worth listening to as energy professionals because we know what we're talking about. So today we're going to talk to you about the Energy Barometer report, which was published during the summer, and you can find the full report at energyinst.org/barometer. This is the 6th of these annual surveys, based on responses from more than 350 professionals within the UK membership of the Energy Institute. And they've been selected to represent the views from right across the energy system, be they involved in the oil and gas sector, the renewables sector, on the energy efficiency or demand side of flexibility businesses. And they range from participants who are established fellows with long careers and great experience, through to our associate members who are in the early stages of their careers and making their mark in the industry. And I think that cross-section of expertise and input from across the system makes actually some of the findings all the more powerful. So let me give you a little bit of context then before I hand over to Steve to start to share the findings. And what an extraordinary year it's been. You can see on the screen there just a timeline where we've captured in the last year or so some of the highlights in terms of the events of the year as they relate to energy. And what an extraordinary year it's been for the world, not least, but also obviously for the sector in terms of what was planned, what was not, and where we find ourselves now. And these events were inevitably fresh in the minds of those who were completing the survey. The preeminence of the energy transition in our energy system is very clear, with coal coming off the grid, for example, renewables starting to outflank fossil fuels, net zero coming into law, the climate strikes that we saw around the world, and news of the UK becoming president of CoP26, which of course now has subsequently been delayed until next year. And of course, we've got the uncertainties around Brexit and the transition period. Those have not gone away. The oil price war between Saudi Arabia and Russia, of course, and not least, the impacts of COVID-19 and the global pandemic. The lockdown and its impacts on our sector, alongside our own lives, unprecedented reductions in economic activity and in surface, sea and air travel around the globe. And therefore, of course, on energy investment, demand for energy itself, and of course, the impacts on greenhouse gas emissions. So against all that as a backdrop, what did our respondents say the biggest challenges were? Well, first of all, there were 3 very, very connected issues that underlined where members' minds are. And in quick snapshot, great start, but still much to do on low carbon energy. We need more of a framework within which business can operate. And we need to be very mindful that these are global challenges that we must rise to. So in terms of low carbon energy, a lack of coherence in planning for decarbonisation across the economy was raised as an issue. While there's been good progress on decarbonising power, of course, which we'll hear about later, EI members urged the move beyond that quickly, much more urgently, to focus on heat as the next big challenge we really must tackle. UK energy policy is still seen as lacking in focus and long-term planning. We know the ultimate destination, but EI members fear that there's the opportunity for risk to come into this in hindering the progress that we will make because of a lack of framework, not necessarily a detailed plan. We need to create space for business to innovate, to deliver, but we do need more structure around the framework so that we can allocate costs in a just way, safeguard supply, and do this in an organised way as much as we can. And of course, that's on a global basis too, when we think about sustainability and climate change. It's clear that the adoption of a 2050 net zero target for greenhouse gas emissions has really focused the minds in the energy industry. Members stress that this is a challenge on a global scale that requires international cooperation to meet global demand for energy whilst reducing emissions. And it's a one hell of a balancing act that we must navigate. And of course, not directly linked, but obviously very much related, was the 4th big challenge that people singled out. Unsurprisingly, this was COVID-19. And it emerged pretty dominant in the discussions and the findings, not least because the survey was still in operation during the last 4 weeks of March, as we in the UK went into lockdown. The pandemic has posed and continues to pose enormous challenge for the energy industry, particularly in the oil and gas sector, where the drop in demand has led to low and volatile prices. And we know that we will see thousands and thousands of job losses in the sector as a result. Energy professionals don't expect demand to bounce back immediately. You can see from the bar chart that you've got up on the screen in front of you, in particular, the lack of bounce back and reduced impacts around passenger travel, journeys on road and rail, and demand for oil and gas. It's pretty clear that people are reticent about how quickly we will return to anything like the levels we saw previously. As you can see there, 90% of respondents expect reduced passenger flights, just as one example, for an extended period. Yet with all this reduced activity, there is still concern amongst members, that bottom bar across the chart there, almost 50-50 split, that suggests that we will not necessarily bank and build on the emissions reductions that we've seen, and that is a risk. And that's why, given this context, it's really important for us to continue to talk about and now take action around why this is such an important moment. So on that note, I'll conclude the context and hand over to Steve. Steve, thank you.
Thanks, Louise, and good morning, everybody. So let me just look into a little bit more details around here, and start off with with some good news, some real successes, because this is a key theme of mine as well. We're often always complaining about the things that we're not doing, as opposed to just at least pausing for a second and reflecting on some of the successes. And of course, you know, I think everyone here will probably recognise what the barometer came up with as the two huge successes, which is the massive increase in renewables on the system over the past or so, and the demise of coal. You know, we've just seen records for coal being off the system. It was a disappointment, unfortunately, when National Grid had to bring a coal station on recently to maintain supplies. So, you know, huge intervention there by successive governments. So one of the themes that we'll come back to is the consistency, as Louise talked about, the framework. And there's no question that this has been consistent. You know, the government has changed, the mechanisms have changed, but there's been a consistent drive to build renewables through direct support of that. And of course, in terms of coal off the system, then setting a regulatory standard that says the coal will be off the system in the early 2020s. And the interesting thing is, you know, that's shifted from where we were, where the power system was clearly the biggest contribution to greenhouse gases in the UK. It is no longer the biggest contribution. It's transport now, as you know. So a huge shift here with a 40% reduction in gas emissions since 1990. And as someone who spent 40 years in the energy industry, you know, and all of the plans that we used to draw back in my oil and gas days, and then my more latter days in the utility sector, always dreaming of a delinking of GDP from energy consumption, whereas we were always making an assumption that as GDP grew, that energy consumption grew. And you know, we've proven without any shadow of a doubt in the last 5 years that those two things are no longer linked together at all. Nick? But if I look forward, and Louise has touched on this, you can see here the professionals who fill this in. And I'd just like to re-emphasize one of Louise's points as well about, you know, the power of this barometer for me has always been the cross-section of people who fill us in. So I remember the first time that we talked to some journalists about this, they all said, well, the oil and gas people would say this, wouldn't they? I said, whoa, no, hang on. You know, less than half the people who fill this in come from the oil and gas sector. We've got energy specialists, from insulation specialists, from home reduction energy consumption, to renewables, to all the networks, etc., to increasingly an awful lot of what I call the newcos in the sector, who are really software and technology businesses. So this is a real cross-section of views. And if you cut into those individuals, you don't find a huge disparity of view either. So we're seeing here, you know, without any question, energy professionals are warning that if we don't set more ambitious policies soon, then our targets are unlikely to be met. If you look at the 2050 target, and we've been asking this question since 2015 actually, And the response has always been, it's fair to say, somewhat sceptical. And of course, that was the old target as well. That was the 80% target that people were sceptical about our ability to meet, let alone our new target of net zero by 2050. So 90% of these experts in the energy world today are expecting us to fall short, given where we are at the moment with policy today. But perhaps more worryingly, because I spend quite a bit of my time as president of the Energy Institute when I get the opportunity to stand on a stage to try and draw people's attention away from 2050. It's so easy to fall into the trap of that's an awfully long way away, isn't it? So, you know, it's all about action tomorrow. And I consistently talk about the next decade, because if we don't really take action in the next decade, then 2050 is kind of for the birds. It's all about the here and now. And this is why this is particularly worrying when we ask questions about the fifth carbon budget target. And, you know, a majority of our members agree that current policies don't go far enough, and we're not going to hit the 57% reduction in greenhouse gas by 2030. And it's, you know, that is just a critical target for me. It really is, to get us on the trajectory. And this is probably a good point to talk about COP26 as well, because I think it's pretty clear from all of the things that we've heard from members here that without immediate policy steps, the ability of the UK, the credibility of the UK is going to be on the line. You know, orchestrating and having the ambition to want to orchestrate an international race to zero is going to require us to have every piece of credibility that we can muster. And it's pretty clear that I think, you know, we have to maintain the stance of the UK as a climate leader. It's the stance that we've had, but our ability to ensure success in COP26 is going to be massively predicated on that. France actually demonstrated that in COP21. You know, it's clear they were walking the walk, and that enabled them to get some of the commitments out of some of the countries to the 2015 commitments. And obviously we're looking now at COP26 for all of those that signed up to those commitments in 2015 to take another step, another leap of their ambitious. So it is only, our members are very clear, it's only with ambitious energy action at home can we really hope to inspire the reciprocation from other countries at COP26 next year. So just to underscore those concerns about our trajectories, you know, this was interestingly, it's so easy that for people, of course, just to point the finger all the time. It's government, isn't it? It's government's issue. And I was delighted that we asked the question in the way this year, which demonstrated that the feeling was, it's both sides actually, that our respondents expressed their dissatisfaction with both the performance of government in terms of continuing to set ambitious policies, but likewise in terms of is industry doing enough? And you can see from this chart here, you know, a big representation of people thinking that industry are not doing enough at the moment. You know, but only 13% of these members actually believe that the government is doing enough to hit the 2050 target. And it's marginally higher, it's 15% believe that industry is doing enough. Now, it will be interesting to read this. There's been an awful lot of announcements by lots of energy companies in the last 3 or 4 months. This may have gone up slightly, but I suspect it's, you know, it's still a reflection of people thinking that their own organisations really aren't doing enough. And even though the target's in place, you know, only 11% of people actually believe they've got an action plan. So as I'm sure everyone will appreciate, it's very easy to make a commitment to something, particularly something, as I said, that's in 2050. But the criticism then comes in about, well, show me the detailed action plan that gets you to 2050. And I would always challenge and show me what you're actually doing in the next 10 years, because that is the critical decade in which we must act. And Louise mentioned COVID was going out at the time. So, you know, we've obviously got that to contend with as well. And it was interesting when this was asked to get some feeling on the implications of COVID. And they were split, as we said. I mean, 40% think that the pandemic would hasten the transition, and a third of the respondents to this survey actually said it would hinder. Interestingly, I took part in an international webinar about 6 weeks ago now, with representatives from Asia, Europe, and the US on. So it's not an Energy Institute thing. Having a similar conversation, actually. It was very interesting around the world to get a view about what people thought the implications of COVID were. And just FYI, Europeans and Asians generally on that particular webinar felt that COVID and the change was a good thing, that actually we were not going to go back to energy consumption as it was, and there was a renewed and vigor behind the development of policies to drive this even faster. Representatives in the US, interestingly, of course, were the other persuasion. So it ended up about 2/3 and a third. So not hugely different from where we were with this group of people in the UK here. But overwhelmingly, our members supported the Climate Change Committee's recommendations for a resilient recovery from COVID, really making support for energy intensive sectors to get on with big action very quickly indeed, and using the change in what we see in society during the pandemic to actually create some long-term benefits here. So there's a real opportunity for all the jargon you hear, the green recovery, huge support from the industry, saying let's not miss this opportunity. Let's make sure that we come out of this in a very different way. And as I said, this was a few months ago now. I suspect this hasn't changed at all from all of the webinars and conversations that the Energy Institute has been hosting over the last month or so. We've done a number on net zero, we've done a number on hydrogen economy, etc. And the enthusiasm across the industry to want to really start to accelerate is there enormously, but it needs a framework, as Louise said, and some policy. So let me that's probably a good point to hand over to Rob, actually, who will explore a bit more some of the solutions that our members have been proposing. So over to you, Rob.
Thank you, Steve, and good morning, everybody, from me. So I should just emphasise before I run through my few slides that the Energy Institute Barometer is a reflection of the views of energy professionals across a wide range of different industries and careers. So this isn't like a trade body telling you what we think the policy asks specifically should be in a kind of self-serving way. And I myself am an academic and director of the UK Energy Research Centre. So this is a kind of an independent view, I think, of what energy professionals believe to be the most important policy issues. And I'm just going to take you through a few of the most standout features of what came through in this year's barometer. So I think the first thing to say is that there's a very, very powerful message, a number of powerful messages actually, about energy efficiency, and in particular about retrofit of domestic properties, houses. We started doing the barometer, I think, 6 years ago, this energy efficiency being a missed opportunity, and the kind of Cinderella option has consistently been the case, and this year it's been singled out as the biggest missed opportunity of the past decade. And it's also, as I'm sure that many of the audience will know, is in many cases the most cost-effective thing that we could be doing. So it's consistently seen as the best measure to help plug the gap in the shortfall for the 5th carbon budget that Steve was just alluding to. Now, we also asked some follow-up questions in the barometer as COVID began to unfold. And so most specifically, when our members were asked about policy priorities to build back better, energy efficiency retrofit came out as absolutely on top. There's lots of estimates of how many jobs. I think that the Chancellor actually referred to something like 100,000 jobs when he announced the Green Homes Grant, which has just now, you can go on the website now and find out how to apply to get a grant for your home to improve energy efficiency, which is absolutely terrific. I think the thing to stress about that, though, is that the Chancellor described it as a down payment. I think it's probably not unfair to say that energy efficiency policy has been languishing actually for certainly for the last 5 years or so. So this down payment is kind of overdue. We really need to get into gear on energy efficiency. And I think the other thing to emphasise is that obviously this is a 1 year thing because it's a kind of very unusual situation response to the pandemic, but it does need to be seen in the context of a multi-decadal infrastructure program actually to improve the quality of our building stock and bring it up to scratch, and that would have many benefits, not just in terms of energy efficiency and carbon abatement, but in terms of thermal comfort and fuel poverty and all of those other good things. So that's the kind of number one top priority in the short term. If we could just go to the next slide, please, Nick, thank you. I'm going to loop back to some of those issues for policy in the immediate term in a moment, but if we just look ahead, if you like, to the longer term, well, nothing is actually particularly long term in energy infrastructure terms, because 2050 is like tomorrow when we're thinking about changing our stock of cars and buildings and aeroplanes and all the rest of it. But just looking at those harder to decarbonise sectors and away from the kind of energy efficiency low-hanging fruit for a moment. So the members were asked to look at the problem sectors, if you like. And so there's a real focus in the barometer this year on the R&D and the kind of testing and demonstration stage of development for low carbon aviation fuels, electric propulsion for aircraft potentially, the use of hydrogen for long distance trucks, and also more attention to modal shift. In particular for for moving freight and products around. Next slide. So looping back, perhaps slightly to the domestic realm, but also thinking about those technologies which we ought to be able to begin to implement and to demonstrate. So first of all, with the heat comes through very, very strongly in the barometer as a priority for attention, and obviously we're seeing that in many of the conversations that people joining this morning will be likely to have been involved in. We absolutely need to take action on the provision of heating. That means that we have to improve energy efficiency. Almost all of the options that we might use to decarbonise heating are kind of predicated on the fabric of the building being more energy efficient, and that's required. I mean, often I think hydrogen for heating, hydrogen in boilers, is kind of presented as kind of the alternative option where you don't need to do anything. Well, that's not really the case, because you move lots of issues upstream. You need to have the hydrogen produced by one means or another, and so it obviously makes much more sense to try and use it as efficiently as possible, even if we're able to make that option work. And the same applies with heat pumps and the other options. So we absolutely need to start moving forward with a rollout of and policies to encourage the development of low carbon heating. The other kind of big technology requirement that comes through in the barometer, which again I think is something that's been on the agenda for a decade and has had a number of false starts and doesn't seem to be getting the traction that it needs in this country or internationally, is carbon capture and storage. And so we know from many of the scenarios from the Committee on Climate Change or from the International Energy Agency that there are some sectors it's going to be impossible basically to decarbonise in the absence of CCS. And we also see that many scenarios for long-term climate stabilisation need negative emissions technologies, and negative emissions technologies require, for the most part, CCS as well. So again, we need to take steps to tackle these hard to decarbonise sectors, and we need immediate policy action to do things to promote the development of CCS, for example, in industrial clusters, and to continue to push the potential for demonstration on power stations. And I think we're seeing some movement in that direction now from government, which is extremely welcome. Next slide. Slight shift of focus, thinking a bit more about the role of the oil and gas industry. As Steve mentioned, there's a significant number of members of the Energy Institute who do come from the oil and gas industry, although by no means dominate anymore the membership of the Energy Institute. And so this slide really is just looking at the evolution of the industry itself. And I'm not going to say too much about it, other than to say perhaps the thing to take away is that as it shifts away from purple and towards blue, it requires a more profound change of the things that the oil and gas industry provides to consumers. And so the industry there, really, professionals are seeing this shift away from traditional, even with end of pipe solutions, towards more innovative forms of provision of energy service, or low carbon liquids, or as Louise mentioned, molecules or electrons that have been decarbonised. I think moving to the last of my slides now, I think this is a terrifically interesting one. I mean, my team at Imperial College were involved in some of the work for the Committee on Climate Change that looked at behaviour change, which got lots of attention. It's certainly been something that's been very much, was pre-COVID at least, was very much in the conversation around what can we do as individuals. And we see in the slides, in the findings there, you know, something of a kind of, I don't know if it's a contradiction or if it's a kind of cognitive dissonance on the part of society. The biggest driver of decarbonisation was seen by our members as being consumer and citizen pressure. And I suppose it's hard to cast our minds back to the kind of going through the looking glass pre-COVID world. But as Louise mentioned, last year there was a huge amount of attention to climate change, whether that's from David Attenborough or Extinction Rebellion. I don't know which of those would have had more influence, but certainly it was seen as being the biggest driver of decarbonisation. And yet, not being able to make those changes is seen as being the second largest impediment to progress. And so what we really need is, I think, policy that enables and encourages and helps those behavioural changes that the people are willing to make, but don't perhaps fully know what the requirements should be, or what they would need to do, or how they would need to do it. Now, whether this is a bit self-serving, that the inadequate steps by business is only 10% of what people who work in the energy industry think is a barrier to net zero, I'll let you consider and judge. But I think this behaviour change issue is something that's going to be on the agenda for many years to come. That's next slide. I'm just checking. Okay, so we're moving on now, handing back to the chair for your questions. Thanks very much.
Rob, thank you. Now to Megan, please, for the questions.
Okay, thanks very much, everyone. I've got a few questions here that were sent in. So from Bill Fortescue of the Energy Industry Club, reduced commercial and transport activity during lockdown has provided a vision of a Britain using less energy. Even in this scenario, gas has typically provided 50% of the energy mix. Is the potential role of gas in the approach to net zero truly being recognised?
Shall I pick that up? Yep. You know, there's a piece of work that I'm involved in with the Royal Academy of Engineering, which is putting in some papers into government to help with the pathway to net zero. And the first paper that was issued was a paper just talking about systems thinking, actually. A statement of the obvious, I think, that, you know, the way we've thought about this before is to think about the energy system in isolation, as opposed to, this is, as Rob touched on, it's the building industry, so it's the housing plans we have, it's the development plans we have, it's transportation in every single aspect here. And if we're to get to net zero, we just can't just have a series of policies that are focused just purely on energy. And when you take that into this question around gas, there's a great danger, I think, of living in a past view, is that gas is a transition fuel. I mean, gas is clearly far better than coal when it's producing energy, but it is still greenhouse gas intensive. So if you look at the primary use of gas in the power system in the future, it's crystal clear to me, I think to other members, that we need carbon capture and storage. We will need some gas generation, but we need that to be associated with carbon capture and storage. As Rob picked up just now, there's a huge amount of work going on now to put hydrogen into our gas system. So that's part and parcel of the transfer of heat without any question at all. So gas in its old form, I think, you know, we will see a diminished use for in the future. But we have invested in an awful lot of infrastructure, so it's completely understandable to ask the question about how can we use that investment for the benefit of society, as we've all paid for it as consumers in the past, but it won't be gas in the way that we thought about it in the past. I don't know whether you want to add anything to that, Rob.
Well, I think one of the things that we need to perhaps give a bit more attention to, and it's a research question in some respects, it's also a question for the industry, is if we're talking about decarbonised gas, I mean, there is potentially a role for bioenergy, biogases, but if we're talking about hydrogen, I think there's an important question about best use. And that's not necessarily a question about least cost use. It's about a kind of an energy system optimization question. If you work on the assumption that I think is reasonable, that hydrogen is either going to be perhaps relatively scarce, made from variable renewables when there's a surplus, or that it's going to be relatively expensive because it's made from natural gas with CCS, which obviously adds to cost, then there's a question about, well, how to best deploy it. And yeah, potentially it could be used for heating in buildings. It could also play a role in transport, in some industrial processes and so on. So I think there's an optimization question around decarbonised gaseous fuels that it needs to be thought through quite carefully as we move forward with it.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Next question then from Professor John Lewis from the Durham Energy Institute. What role does the panel see for secure, home-produced, ultra-low carbon, low enthalpy geothermal energy for displacement of natural gas as an agent for space heating? Now, if we want a bit of background on that one, the UK has currently about 5 megawatts of installed low enthalpy capacity in Gateshead and Southampton, with about the same again planned and funded. This is extracting heat from old flooded mines. Globally, about 70,000 megawatts is installed, with about 2,500 megawatts in France and 3,000 in Germany. Similarly sized in Sweden. Not of these other traditional hot geothermal nations like Italy, Iceland, and New Zealand, if that helps with the question.
Thanks, Megan. And I think it is very helpful, because for me that sort of context highlights the challenge that we have with heat. And when we hear people talk about, is it going to be gas or is it going to be electrify everything, I don't think that's particularly helpful, because I think the answer with heat is that it will be a number of solutions. And as you've just described in the background from the question, it's about the geography, the nature of the right application, and the environment in which you're going to be, or what it is that you're heating. So urban, decentralized, local community solutions will look very different to heat solutions that are sort of off-grid in large rural spaces, and doing very different things with different needs. And I think so for policymakers, trying to push people down a certain pathway of, you know, do we electrify everything and that's the answer for heat, or do we go full swing with hydrogen, etc., heat pumps, geothermal, whatever the technology and the application, I think the answer is we need all of those things in the right applications in the right context, so that we get this done in the least cost way possible and in the fairest way possible for the consumer. I don't know if Rob or Steve want to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, a lot of the thinking that's going on when we talk about policy, we think about a national policy, etc. And I think hidden in Louise's answer is there's some opportunities here where we don't have national policies as such. We have local and regional policies. I mean, if you point to Scotland, for example, I mean, we don't have a gas network in Scotland, in northern Scotland today. So clearly some of the answers for heat in Scotland are going to be very different than those in the south. I think the challenge comes back to, you know, how do you coordinate this to make sure that it's at the least possible cost? And how do you do it in a speedy way? Because, you know, we don't have, so earlier, a decade to sit back and think about all this. We need to get on with some of these things today, actually. So it is a combination of local plans that build up to a national plan. And I think those plans, as Louise mentioned earlier, we should be very careful about a desire that the people, certainly in the industry, often have for, can you dot every I and cross every T, please, and give me a huge amount of detail. What we need in this race to net zero is a series of frameworks that allow for innovation and people to get on with action, but not looking for great detailed plans because they'll just take too long.
Just very quickly, I mean, I think I can't really comment on the kind of resource base or feasibility of the kind of coal mine derived heat extraction that the question refers to. I don't have any knowledge on that, but I mean, one thing that I would just emphasize is that the potential role of district heating and the very low penetration of district heating in Britain in comparison to Northern European neighbours on the same latitude. And there's a number of historical reasons for that, not least, you know, climatic factors and availability of North Sea gas, or previously town gas, actually, then North Sea gas. The thing about district heating, it gives you option value in terms of decarbonisation, because there's a number of heat sources that you can then provide. And so I think, you know, one of the things which I guess builds on Steve's and Louise's points is, you know, thinking about option creation through infrastructure is hugely important. And, you know, given that we're in a kind of an economic environment where borrowing money is very cheap, it does give an opportunity for infrastructure investment to be carried out at a particularly cost-effective point in history. So whether that might be the provision of hydrogen through networks, the construction of networks for CCS, or indeed heat infrastructure in towns and cities, I think you know, should be really thinking long term about those enabling infrastructures.
Great, thank you all for that. I've got another question from Douglas Chapman, MP for Dunfermline and West Fife. Looking at, with consideration towards the Green Bus Fund, part of a £3 billion fund announced last February. So considering that, should the government be prioritising transition to zero transport despite COVID impacting on passenger numbers and making bus transport less attractive in the short term? And also, so two-part question, still on transport, when we move large amounts of product by sea, are we doing enough to move seaborne cargo ships to hydrogen? And what would be a game changer in this area? So two parts to the question there.
If I may, Megan, can I connect that with one of the questions that's in the chat box too? Because Titus has raised a point which I think links into this answer, where he talks about, you know, is it important that we harness the attitudinal changes in society as part of the COVID recovery, and I think these two things do connect. So absolutely, I think we should plough on with decarbonising the transport system, just as we should with heat, and moving the entire economy to a low carbon energy system. It's incredibly important, but I think the challenge for government, particularly in its thinking, is to adjust its mindset to be more in tune with those attitudinal and societal changes that we have experienced in the last 6 months that Titus was referring to. So for all of the current programmes and plans that there are around, whether that's transport or any other part of the infrastructure that we make use of, we do need to consider how will we operate and live and work differently in the future. A number of organisations, for example, are very much surveying their workforce, and home working will become a regular part of the future. pandemic or otherwise. People have found that they can work this way. They prefer this with work-life balance. They want the social interaction, but actually they don't have to deal with presenteeism in expensive office blocks in central London. So, there needs to be decisions around and reflections around how do we change the policy decisions or adjust the policy mechanisms that we have in place in order to adapt to that and really take on the benefits of the attitudinal and societal changes that we've had. I can't comment on the detail for Douglas on the bus fund, but maybe somebody else in the call can do. And absolutely, there needs to be more done in terms of sea transport. Whether air, sea, cargo, freight, all transport needs direct attention. And it's a little bit of a red herring, I think, to be very focused on domestic EVs and what's happening there, and not thinking about actually some of the much bigger challenges around transport that we face. I don't know if colleagues have got anything.
Yeah, well, I'll just pick up on the bus bit. I mean, it's just a personal view for what it's worth. I would be absolutely in favour of continuing with the bus fund. There's huge amount of aspiration, as you know, whether it's Stagecoach or First Group, etc., or Arriva, they're all, as businesses in financial trouble, but they've all got very ambitious plans based on their agenda and also the agenda of the cities in which they service to transfer their fleet onto electric. I think it's the right thing to do. I think it'd be a huge mistake for us to now think, oh, because of COVID, we don't need buses anymore. I mean, I'm with Louise in terms of the place of work will change dramatically. That does not remove the reality of the fact that we would prefer people to actually travel on public transport than actually drive themselves in for the 2 days or 3 days a week that they do go into work, or people going in and out of cities as well. So I think it'd be a massive mistake to slow that down. It's got real momentum at the moment, and we should push ahead with it.
Great, thank you, Louise and Steve. So we're going to have one final question. I know there have been other questions asked. We'll forward those on, and we'll get some answers back to you as well. But we will just do this one final question on the call, which is from Simon Pine from Greener Energy Futures, who says, we know that the technology exists and UK Limited could fund zero carbon. We're achieving modern progress at best. Surely we need to be more ambitious and challenge the need for GDP growth and short-term economic gain.
Don't disagree with Simon at all. I think that's been the sentiment of a lot of what we've been talking about here this morning, Megan, to be honest. And I think it is ambition, but it's also bravery. It's bravery for all of the constituents that are involved in this, whether that's the consumer that makes the choices they do and sticks to those, whether that's the government in setting the framework, and the regulators being proactive around their role in the system, and obviously business then feeling confident and entrepreneurial and innovative in the work that they do. So this is it is a really important moment, and as Steve said, we really don't have any more time to sit and talk about it, but we do and can only succeed with this if we do this together. So everybody needs to step up and be brave.
Yeah, I think we've all said the same thing, so it sounds like we're in violent agreement there. I just re-emphasise this is the decade of action without any question, and we know, just to hit a couple of headlines, £1 spent on infrastructure generally actually generates between £2 and £3 of GDP. There's a lot of infrastructure investment here, so the green recovery building is good for the economy. We've got a lot of innovation in this country, our basis of science and engineering, and this is an opportunity for us to build on that and create even more for the future that's exportable. And I talked about the joined up thinking piece between transport and energy. The other piece I'd point to that comes out in our survey as well that we didn't talk to today is skills. We've got to make sure that the skills generation, the use of the apprentice levy, further education, STEM education, all of those things tie in here as well, because we're building a skill set for the future as well that's going to help our economy enormously and create real competitive advantage. So I'm a great believer actually that the opportunity, as Louise says, that we've got right now is a wonderful opportunity, and it is not fictitious, it is not political speak, it's absolutely real, but we've got to get on with things.
I mean, yeah, just to kind of come in on the kind of measure of economic welfare, which I think I understood correctly, was lying behind the question. So should we be moving away from GDP? I mean, so I think, you know, frankly, the first thing to say about that is that the Energy Institute is not really concerned with the kind of environmental economics and measures of macroeconomic well-being kind of part of the conversation. And I think we could have another very long and interesting conversation about how best to measure well-being and the limitations of GDP. And I don't really want to kind of, you know, stray too far into that or too far into the philosophical, but I think, you know, one of the observations that I would make, I'd very much echo Steve's point about skills and the supply chain, because one of the challenges that we're going to face with doing any of these things at a pace, so let's take energy efficiency retrofit in domestic properties for an example, is that we don't actually have the capability and the wherewithal and the human resources that are needed to do that. So that needs to be ramped up very, very quickly. Otherwise, we're going to hit bottlenecks, and otherwise it's going to go wrong. And certainly one of the experiences that we've seen in countries, for example, that are further ahead with us than we are with the rollout of lower carbon forms of heating, is that they kind of went through a period where they had problems, and they were linked to skills and supply chain and quality of installation and certification. So all of those things are very, very important. I think that's slightly off topic for the question. To come back to the question, you know, whether or not GDP is a very good measure or whether it's the right way to look at things, I think if we were in a kind of a macroeconomic context where the economy was roaring away and we weren't doing enough to protect the environment or to address climate change, I think we'd be more concerned about, this is personal opinion, I think we'd be more concerned about that question, because we'd be impeding GDP growth in order to address our other worries, potentially. If we're, you know, in the current context where we're actually looking at unprecedented collapse in conventional measures of economic activity in GDP, and we're looking at stimulus and so on, I think it's more helpful to focus on the contribution that investment in a green recovery can make to the recovery overall, and to talk about the co-benefits that are associated with investment in lower carbon infrastructure. You know, contextually, things have changed compared to where we were even 5 years ago, because many of the low carbon options have come so far down their cost curves that they are already at, you know, close to being cost competitive, and that will only increase if we put more investment into them. So that kind of unasks your question in a way, and kind of sidesteps the very important question about how useful GDP is as a measure of economic welfare. And I'm not trying to do that, but I do think that perhaps what we need to foreground in the current context is all of the many economic benefits that can stem from getting on with taking action on the low carbon agenda that the government's already fully signed up to with the 2050 targets.
That's great. Thank you very much, Louise, Steve and Robert. Like I said, there were a couple more questions, but we'll send those over to the speakers and get them back to you, and I'll pass back to the chairman.
Well, thank you very, very much indeed. Can I first of all thank you, Megan, for doing the questions, and obviously thank Louise, Steve and Rob for your presentations. Incredibly interesting presentations, incredible amount to think about as well. And we've got some huge challenges ahead of us. And with COVID-19 still not conquered, I think we're going to have becoming more and more aware, or acutely aware of what's going on around us. So I'm very grateful to that.